Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Pre- and Post-Civil War Slave Narratives, a professional development webinar sponsored by America in Class from the National Humanities Center. The slides are moving on their own here tonight, ladies and gentlemen. I am Richard Schramm, the Vice President for Education Programs at the National Humanities Center, and I'll be serving as the moderator for this evening's session. Before we get underway, let me tell you a little bit about the Humanities Center. We're located in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. We are the country's only independent institute for advanced study in all branches of the humanities. That means we bring fellows, scholars to the center from across the world to research and write on topics in history, literature and language study, philosophy, criticism of the arts, that sort of thing. We also offer an extensive series of programs and resources for high school teachers of American history and literature. And if you go to americainclass.org, you will land on this page, and from this page you will be able to gain access to all of the things that we offer for teachers of American history and literature. Now, we also would like you to go to the pre- and post-Civil War webpage, because there, at the end of the program this evening, you will find a recording of the seminar. You will also find the PowerPoint, and you feel free to plunder that PowerPoint and use it in your classes. That's what it's there for. In addition, you will find an evaluation, and we ask you to fill that out and send it back to us. And once you've done that, you will be able to download a letter documenting your participation in the program. You can submit that to your local certifying authority to obtain whatever recertification credit your participation warrants. Now, how do you participate? Well, this evening, Professor Andrews is going to be making remarks keyed to a presentation of slides with key excerpts that illustrate important points. We'll be stopping from time to time to ask discussion questions, and we'll also be stopping to include your comments and questions in the program. And the way to pose those comments and questions and to respond to our questions is to put your cursor in that green box that I bracketed, which you'll find in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Type your message, hit that send button to the right, and your message will appear in the large chat box above, and I will bring that into the conversation at appropriate times throughout the seminar. Now, we ask you to respond to our questions, but please don't be afraid to ask your own questions or make comments. Give us feedback on how you teach the material. If you see a passage that's usable in class, let us know how you would present it. And if you see a potential project or assignment in the material, share it with us. The more you participate, the better the webinar. And our best webinars have been those in which we've had a lot of exchange between our scholar and the participants. So let's get underway. You posed some really interesting questions in the seminar forum. You would like this seminar to help you get beyond the black people were nothing more than slaves and the slavery was bad responses to a more nuanced understanding of slavery and its effect on the enslaved. Elizabeth Keckley, one of the people we'll be looking at this evening, wrote that slavery had its dark side as well as its bright side. She wrote her memoir as a way of placing Mrs. Lincoln in a better light before the world, asserting that both my own character as well as the character of Mrs. Lincoln was at stake. No, she has a distinctive perspective. How does her narrative, with that distinctive perspective, fit into the slave narrative genre? Finally, a really interesting question. What was the relationship between post-Civil War slave narratives and progressivism? We have two goals for our program this evening. First, we hope to learn how and why slave narratives changed and evolved over the course of the 19th century. Second, to examine these changes with regard to the portrayal of slavery itself, the image of slaveholders, the role of force and violence, slave culture, sexual exploitation, and standards of moral judgment in the antebellum and postbellum slave narrative. To lead us through these questions and to bring us to these goals, we are very pleased to have with us tonight William L. Andrews, the E. Maynard Adams Professor of English at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Bill has written widely on African American slave narratives. You see some of his publications right there, and rather than read them, I am simply going to turn the program over to him. And let me unmute his microphone so that he can lead us through a discussion of pre- and post-Civil War slave narratives. There we go. Okay, Bill, it's all yours.
Thank you, Richard. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm pleased to have a chance to do this. It's been my pleasure to do one or two other seminars, webinars like this in the past, and I've always enjoyed them, and so I hope that this will be worthwhile for those of you who are listening in. The topic is one that I've been interested in for quite a while because I've studied the whole history of the slave narrative in American literature and culture, from the earliest ones published in the mid-18th century all the way up to those that were published and written in the late 20th century. It's a genre that more people know about from the famous Antebellum figures, but they don't really understand or may not even be aware of the fact that the slave narrative continued to be published. And in fact, after 1865, there was more productivity of slave narratives than there was before. You go from 1800 to 1865, there were 87 book-length or separately published, I call them. They weren't all book-length, but they were published in various separate publications, magazines, 87 of them published the first 65 years, which is comes to an average of 1.3 slave narratives every year. But then between 1865 and the time that Booker T. Washington published Up From Slavery in 1901, there were 56 book-length or separately published narratives published, an average of 1.6 per year. So there was actually a greater productivity of slave narratives after the Civil War than before. As you've seen, for me, the epitome of the difference between the way the genre portrays slavery before the war and then how it portrays slavery after emancipation is summed up in the two metaphors of slavery that appear in the narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, and Up From Slavery.
Yeah, Bill, I'm sorry, if I could just interrupt for 1 second. If you could please speak a bit louder. Some folks are having difficulty hearing you, and we might also want to increase the volume of your microphone. I'm sorry for this intrusion, but if you could go up to that microphone icon at the top of your page and hit that drop-down menu, you're likely to see adjust microphone volume. If you could slide the microphone volume slide up all the way, that might help. We certainly want everyone to hear what you have to say this evening. Okay.
How is that? Is that better?
Okay. How is that, folks? That better? Well, yeah. Okay. Now, all right. Turn it down a little bit. Now you're a little bit loud. Okay.
You said turn it all the way up?
Try it now. Say something for us now. Okay. You there, Bill? Oh, wait a minute. Okay, try it now. Is that good?
How is that? Does that sound better?
Okay, well, let's see. We just got two folks here, and okay, I can hear fine. So that sounds like a yes to me. Sorry, Bill, for the interruption, but let's go ahead, please.
So I was mentioning the two metaphors that I think are so striking and indicative. The metaphor of slavery as a tomb that you get when you read the narrative, and Douglass sort of sums up the significance of his battle with Edward Covey, the slave breaker. He portrays himself as emerging from a tomb, actually being resurrected from a tomb into the heaven of freedom. In this case, he's portraying slavery as such a horrible, desperate, destructive experience that individual rebellion is required and indeed justified to enable one to keep from being entombed within slavery. Whereas in Up From Slavery and Washington's striking use of the metaphor of the school of slavery and describing the effect of the going to this school by the generations of slaves who went through this school, he implies that the school was actually a kind of benefit, that within the school the slaves actually gained rather than lost social identity and social purpose.
Bill, sorry to interrupt again, but shall we move to those texts? We have those, of course, on the slides, and it might be worthwhile to see precisely where these images enter the text. Shall we move ahead to those slides?
We can, certainly.
Yeah,
can.
Why don't we do that? There we go. Up there we go. Frederick Douglass. There we go. Okay, because it's good to focus people on the actual text. Thank you.
Okay, so here is the glorious resurrection from the tomb of slavery to the heaven of freedom, and the spirit of the narrator rises. Bold defiance took its place. Slavery is such a terrible thing that it requires and justifies resistance, violent resistance if necessary, in order for a person like Frederick Douglass simply to preserve his own self-confidence, his own hope for the future. And so it's a truly desperate situation for someone like Douglass in this case. Whereas when we get to Washington, he is talking about the school of slavery as something that left the 10 million Negroes who went through the school in a stronger situation than they were before they began. Actually, Washington suggests that the school of slavery is part of a kind of general civilizational experience that helps those who came from Africa be prepared materially, intellectually, morally, and religiously to live in the West and to be successful and well integrated into Western life. So these are very striking distinctions between one view of slavery, which says that it's a life and death contest, and there's a kind of revolutionary freedom, harking back to the American Revolution itself, that's being invoked when Douglass says he has to fight in order to preserve his selfhood. Whereas for Up From Slavery, it's not fighting that gets you to freedom. It's working and earning through meritorious action, a kind of freedom that is not the product of a lonely quest for freedom far away, but rather a struggle within slavery and a winning of the right to freedom, and what we could call the refining effect of slavery almost as a crucible in which traditional values, middle class values, and aims in life become really refined and I always say, from this standpoint of the school, it's as though African Americans graduated, and somehow as a result of graduating, when emancipation came, they were ready to enter the new world of freedom and to be successful in it. So,
Scott, excuse me, Bill. Go ahead, please. I've got a question I want to jump in with, but please go ahead and finish your thought.
Well, go ahead and let's have the question.
Well, it's an excellent question. Douglass knew slavery as an adult. Washington knew it pretty much as a child. So how do those different perspectives shape their narratives?
Yes, I think it's true that Douglass's experience of slavery was during his first 20 years of life. So he had seen it in many ways in its best form, that is, its least oppressive form. He had been a house slave in Baltimore, that is, in a big city, where if you were going to have to be a slave, you'd much rather be a slave in a big city like Baltimore than out in the boondocks on a plantation like the one where he was born. So Douglass had seen, in some sense, the best of slavery in that regard, but he'd also seen the worst of it when he had to work in the fields for a year for Edward Covey, a very brutal and unrelenting master. So Douglass had seen all sides, you could say. Washington, on the other hand, certainly not been born into a cushy life as a slave. There's no indication that when he was enslaved that he got to work in a house for a family the way that Douglass describes his earliest experience as a boy working as a houseboy for the Auld family in Baltimore. Washington mostly knew slavery from observation rather than from direct experience.
Oh.
His observations tend to emphasize the positive. There were things that Washington experienced in slavery that were very ugly, but in his autobiography, he tends to emphasize the good things that he got from slavery rather than the worst things that he saw in slavery.
Oh. Okay, so his experiencing slavery as a younger person sort of mitigated his sense of the evil of the institution.
Well, he never had to be an adult slave. He never had to work as an adult in the kind of punishing circumstances that, at least particularly during the year that Douglass spent with Covey, he knew.
Right. Yeah, he felt the full brunt of it. Well, shall we move ahead then? And if you'd like us to read some of these passages to get them on the table for everybody to discuss, just let me know.
Sure. Let's go ahead and move on to the first, unless there are other questions just about the very brief comments that I've made so far. There are many other things that one can say about the differences between pre- and post-Civil War slave narratives. The narrators themselves are different in one really important respect, and that is that most of the narratives published before 1865, and especially the most famous ones, were written by people who escaped slavery, who were a part of a tiny minority of people who actually got out of slavery and stayed out. That is, they weren't recaptured. They set out to get to the North, and they made it. Whereas 3 out of 4 people who wrote about slavery after emancipation and their experience of slavery never escaped slavery at all. They were people who went through slavery, they endured it, they survived it, and they came out the other side. So they had a very different type of story to tell, because they had not been the sort of person Douglass describes himself as being, the sort of rebel individualist hero. These are people who are much more like the average person, who might not have ever been in a position to make an escape like Frederick Douglass. Many of these people write their stories from the standpoint of a man or a woman who had a family in slavery, unlike Douglass, and who couldn't just say, I'm going to run away, because to do so would mean to leave behind one's spouse or one's children or other loved ones. That it just made it impossible to imagine how to do that. So there are a number of life circumstances that make the narratives before 1865 so different from the 165. At any rate, let's go back and look at the two narratives, Douglass's and Washington's, from the standpoint of the experience that each is describing. The key thing, I think, for Douglass is that his experience and this turning point of his career as a slave has a great deal to do also with his feelings about himself as an individual and as a man. He It talks about his great and deep sense of manhood, my sense of my own manhood. And no one knows exactly what Douglass means by that. But certainly in the antebellum tradition, and it's of course dominated by male writers, there are very few female writers before 1865. In fact, there are more after 1860. The idea of defending and asserting one's manhood very much wrapped up in the idea of masculine pride, self-confidence, and freedom. These are all part of the same sort of thing, and the sense of masculine pride in Douglass, I think, is unmistakable. That he can take pride in himself as a man who stood up for himself, who fought back, and who demanded that his spirit be recognized in this bold defiance. Whereas when you get to Washington, and he talks about his attitudes in thinking about slavery, he starts out by talking about pity for people who get entangled in the net of slavery. Talks about no bitterness in him towards white people. No one section of our country was wholly responsible for its introduction, and besides, it was recognized and protected for years by the general government. Having once got its tentacles fastened onto the Republic, it was no easy matter for the country to relieve itself of the institution. So when you read this, you almost get the feeling that no one's really to blame for slavery. His use of passive voice verbs becomes a way for Washington not to have to point the finger at any particular person or persons or groups of people. It's not his manner and it's not his politics to look back into the past and rehash what he feels are the terrible things that went on in slavery. So his sense of individuality, his sense of manhood, that's not his big issue. His big issue is much more, as he says, as he goes on, that he wants to see where we're going, not where we've been. And so he says, when persons ask me these days how in the midst of what sometimes seems hopelessly discouraging conditions, I can have such faith in the future, he speaks of providence. He speaks of going through the wilderness and coming out of the wilderness. And he doesn't have to stress anything so much about his own masculine sense of pride as much as he can take a great deal of pride and satisfaction in what we are doing as a people, my race in this country, rather than what I did or what I'm doing right now. So if we move on, I've got several examples of the way a couple of important antebellum narratives begin, and then an example to compare in the case of Washington, how his narrative begins. The Life of William Grimes, a Runaway Slave, is the first fugitive slave narrative to be published in the United States. When you read the beginning of William Grimes's narrative, you can see that he talks about himself in a very direct and straightforward manner. I was born in the year 1784 in Jay County of King George, Virginia, in a land boasting its freedom and under a government whose motto is liberty and equality. The irony there is unmistakable. I was yet born a slave. My father was one of the most wealthy planters in Virginia. And it talks about his family. I was, in law, a bastard and slave and owned by Dr. Steward. Then he starts talking about his father, a wild sort of man, very much feared by his neighbors, got into this shooting incident, was jailed. And Grimes finishes up with his father by saying, "My father, I have no doubt, would have bought and freed me if I had not been sold and taken off while he was in jail. I suppose my father would have been hung, and whether wealth and powerful friends procured his escape, I know not. It is, however, a sufficient commentary upon that event and upon my fortune that I then thought and now speak on the subject with indifference. He died at his own house. That he suffered his blood to run in the veins of a slave is the only reflection I would cast upon his memory, which is just none at all, in the slave states. He was a very brave man, I reckon." So Grimes's feelings about his father tell you a great deal about his feelings about his initial experience in slavery, how he came to be a slave, what it is that slavery meant to him. And it's very much, I think, at the beginning of the story that we feel from the beginning Grimes's sense of injury, his resentment, his sense of the outrage of being born in a land that boasts of freedom, being born of a father who liked to be known as one of the wealthy planters of Virginia, and yet what did this man do in terms of his own son? Well, because his son was a bastard and a slave, Grimes says, I recall him at best with indifference. This is the kind of beginning for antebellum slave narratives that was designed to shock readers, get their attention right away, and to make them see just how unjust slavery was. No pulling of punches, no backing away from the ugly truths, but to put it right in front of the reader, right in their face, in the most hard-hitting sort of way. And the father, the white father in some of these accounts, certainly becomes an example of the white American male and the way such a man can do these things as far as siring children in slavery and then walk away and have no responsibility, no social consequences whatsoever. When you get to Moses Roper, this was a very widely read narrative published in England in 1837. This is the one of the later reprintings, but it was published far and wide, and you can see why if you look at the opening paragraph. I was born in North Carolina in Caswell County. I'm not able to tell in what year or month. And then he proceeds to describe the circumstances of his birth. And we can see as we move along that he is saying in a very diplomatic way that his father was his master and his mother was one of his father's slaves. Then as soon as his father's wife learns that he's been born, she already suspects that he is the son of the master. So she aims to do away with this infant as soon as the child is born. And it's only through luck that the little baby Moses is saved. So the purpose, I think, of starting out a story this way is, again, to deliver the hard-hitting facts of slavery in a way that no one can ignore. It's really gut-level storytelling here, and the fact of the narrator's beginnings are that I was born in violence, and the rest of his story, these adventures that are described in the narrative of the adventures and escape of Moses Roper tend to be very grisly. He is a man who suffers tremendously, and yet, of course, the irony, the picture of Moses Roper, he looks like a white gentleman, except for the fact that his hair is an indication of his African ancestry as well. So as we move through here and we see these ways that these stories begin in the antebellum period, they help to highlight the big difference between these narratives that were widely known in the early 19th century, and then you get to Booker T. Washington, the most famous of the post-Civil War narratives. I was born a slave on a plantation in Franklin County, Virginia. I am not quite sure of the exact place or exact date of my birth, but at any rate, I suspect I must have been born somewhere and at some time. There's a kind of casualness about that. It's almost a bit of humor that we have in this understatement. There's no bitterness. There's no resentment. He acknowledges that my life had its beginning in the midst of the most miserable, desolate, and discouraging surroundings. But then he backs off the possible conclusion someone might jump to by saying this was so not because my owners were especially cruel, for they were not, as compared with many others. And so just that statement tells you something about Washington and I think many of his compatriots in the post-Civil War narrative. Cruelty is a matter of comparison. It is a relative thing. It's not something that he's going to define as an absolute and then say, this person was cruel, this person was not. He's going to say cruelty is all a matter of perspective, and as I said, a matter of comparison, one person to another. He won't say that slavery, which is pretty striking. Instead, he sort of lets his owners off the hook and says they weren't especially cruel at all. And so Washington seems to be trying very hard not to blame people for his circumstances, even his father. Of my father I know even less than of my mother. I do not even know his name. I have heard reports to the effect that he was a white man who lived on one of the nearby plantations. Whoever he was, I never heard of his taking the least interest in me or providing in any way for my rearing. But I do not find a special fault with him. He was simply another unfortunate victim of the institution, which the nation unhappily had engrafted upon it at that time. So here's Washington.
Bill, Bill, your mention, I'm sorry to interrupt, but your mention of Booker T. Washington's sort of desire not to blame anyone raises a question, allows me to bring in a question one of our participants sent in earlier. Michelle writes, I have never thought that Booker T. Washington was saying that no one was to blame, but that everyone is to blame, not just Southern whites, but that blaming was backwards progress. So in blaming everyone, is he in effect blaming no one? How does that work? And I think this also introduces the question of Booker T. Washington's audience and his purpose. If he starts blaming the white people on whom he needs support, they may take great umbrage at that and walk away from him. So how would you respond to Michelle there?
I think it is exactly true that Washington is very much concerned with how people, especially white people, and of course he's publishing this book commercially with a very well-known white publisher. He wants to be very careful about laying the responsibility of slavery at a particular door. So it would have been much easier for an antebellum narrator to blame the South for slavery and to present the North as a land of freedom. Washington doesn't want to blame the South for slavery because he works in the South, number one, and he lives right in the middle of Alabama. So if he becomes known as someone who abuses the lost cause, as the Alabama white people would have called it at the time of from slavery, he would have had a whole lot more difficulty. So he tries to say that really it is a part of the national history. It's not the particular failure morally, socially, economically of the South. To some degree that is true, of course, that slavery was a nationally justified institution through the Constitution of the United States. So, as always, Washington is part right, but there's also a question of, well, surely someone is to blame. Are you saying that you want to avoid holding anyone morally responsible for slavery? I think that Washington's answer would be, it's not really important to go back and start trying to identify who were the people who were culpable. It's much more important that we pay attention to where we are now, how we've come through this, and what we can claim as our strengths as a result of having gone through slavery.
Mm-hmm. So Michelle is correct in saying that Washington saw this blaming matter as an obstacle to progress. Put it behind us, keep our eyes on the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that allows me to bring up that question in the forum about the relationship of post-Civil War narratives to progressivism, perhaps not progressivism, but the reformist progressive impulse that was abroad in the land, not just represented by Booker T. Washington, by others in the 1890s and on into the early 20th century. How do these narratives relate to that impulse?
I think that they're not explicitly progressivist in the political sense, but the large majority of post-Civil War narrators emphasize progress and identify themselves as progressive men and women who are progressing. That is, they're moving up. They're moving, as Washington would say, up from slavery. But they're also progressive in the sense that they say African American people, the people who went through slavery, are focused on what we can accomplish now and in the future. We're not focused on how badly we were treated in the past. And so their emphasis is on reconciliation between whites and blacks, between masters and slaves, former masters, former slaves. And that's all about trying to ensure a better future that is mutually beneficial to both sides of the equation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Pat Marshall follows up on that comment. She talks about the kind of rhetorical situation Booker T. Washington was in, walking the tightrope between chastising whites for the peculiar institution and convincing them they need to abolish its vestiges requires clever writing. So there was certainly a strategic element in Washington's treatment of blame.
Yes, he was much more interested in forming alliances with what he felt were the progressive Southerners, and anything that he could do to emphasize positive signs of change in the South, he liked to do, because he felt that you can't really change a man, as he said, up from slavery by abusing him. You have to give him encouragement. You have to show him where you think progress is being made, and then try to show the basis on which further progress can be built.
Right, and Scott refines Pat's comment on Washington's rhetorical situation. Progress, he writes, emphasized at a time when Southern redemptionism was at a high water mark and disenfranchisement and Jim Crow were characterizing the South. So that just further highlights the delicate situation that Washington found himself in the latter part of the 19th century.
Yes, it's true. Up from Slavery is written in what some historians have called the sort of the nadir of African American fortunes in the South. And Washington is writing in a way to try to encourage change and hope in ways that there don't seem to be many changes and not much hope. But that is typical of the antebellum, of the postbellum mood of most of these writers. They tend to emphasize much more the positive and the constructive, and want to spend as little time as necessary on the hurtful past unless to emphasize it is to show how I have overcome, how I have left behind whatever would hold me back, either psychologically or socially or economically, and therefore to say that, yes, I know what happened to me and I can tell you some of this, but what I've done since I got out of slavery and how that is a sign that I am ready, willing, and able to be successful in the world of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we've got just a little short of an hour left. Shall we move ahead?
Sure. After looking at these two people, let's look at My Southern Home by William Wells Brown. That was published in 1880, the book My Southern Home. It was Brown's least famous autobiography, but it was his postbellum narrative. Far more famous is Brown's 1847 narrative of William W. Brown, a fugitive slave, which, next to Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative, is generally considered to be the most widely read and influential slave narrative of the antebellum period. When Brown writes this narrative, Douglass has achieved a great deal of fame and acclaim for his narrative, and that's one reason I think why Brown felt it was high time for him to publish his own. Here is a well-known passage in the very opening pages of Brown's narrative, in which he describes the terrifying experience for him as a little boy, hearing his mother being beaten. Here we see that Brown had already been separated from his mother and put in the house. He was being raised as a house servant, a situation preferable to that of a field hand. And of course, his mother was a field hand, in that the little boy was better fed, better clothed, and not obliged to rise at the ringing of the bell. So he's actually lying in his bed in the house, in Master's house. So he has his own bunk, and he's living in Master's house. He's not living with his mother. He's not with his family. He's already been separated from them. And he hears this going on, and of course he's horrified and he's terrified as the sounds come into his awareness. He remains at the door, however. He doesn't go to his mother. He can't. He's already learned enough to know that he can't intervene, especially as a child, in something like this. And so there's this pathetic introduction that he has to the cruelty of slavery, hearing his own mother being beaten 10 lashes just for being late for the bell, a bell that rings before dawn, and she is not quite there, and so she's given this excruciating punishment that her son must listen to and can do absolutely nothing about. Now, when Brown finished this autobiography and published it in 1847, it was very widely read and very well received. He published multiple editions of it in the latter years of the anti-slavery struggle. He became internationally famous for it, as well as, of course, for writing Clotel, or the President's Daughter, in 1853, the first really full-length novel published by an African American. Went on to become really the first African American man of letters, that is, kind of belletristic letters in the literary tradition of Black America. After the Civil War, his literary career was not as remunerative, you might say, to him. He identified himself as an MD, and wanted to continue with his writing, but he didn't have the opportunity to write as much and didn't have quite the public recognition that he had before the war. At any rate, in 1880, he published My Southern Home, an odd title for a book that is at all times that economies seemed to demand, yet a certain degree of punishment was actually needed to ensure respect to the master and good government to the slave population. So here Brown is making generalizations about slavery. He's not getting into the specifics. He's not talking about individuals. He's not getting too close to his own experience. Generalizations are a bit like the kinds of generalizations that Washington would engage in when he talks about slavery 2 decades later. No one knows exactly why Brown made this statement that cruelty to Negroes was not practiced in our section, because his 1847 narrative shows that it definitely was. But this is one arresting difference between the antebellum Brown and the postbellum Brown, as well as these statements. While the peculiar institution was a great injury to both master and slaves, yet there was considerable truth in the oft-repeated saying that the slave was happy. You can bet that in 1847, William Wells Brown would have never written a word of that sentence. He would not have said anything like that. But in 1880, he's trying to say, well, what would be meant by happy? And he's using quotation marks in an interesting way here, because I would guess, no one knows for sure, that Brown is referring to the evolving image of the Old South in popular literature beginning in the early 1880s and going well up into the early 20th century. The return of the image of the old plantation and the happy life lived by the black folks who were enslaved on the plantation, how well they were treated, how fortunate was the relationship between such slaves and their high-bred, upper-class, moonlight and magnolias masters and mistresses. So Brown says it was a low kind of happiness that the slaves had, existing only where masters were disposed to treat their servants kindly, and where the proverbial lightheartedness of the latter prevailed. But even as he attempts to qualify this notion of the happy slave that was, as I said, coming back into vogue, especially in Southern writing in the 1880s and 1890s, he nevertheless subscribes to certain stereotypical proverbial views of the lightheartedness of the slave. Then he goes on to generalize again about the Negro in the next paragraph: sympathetic in his nature, thoughtless in his feelings, both alimentativeness and amativeness large. The Negro is better adapted to follow than to lead. That statement certainly would not apply to William Wells Brown himself, yet he's willing to make this sort of generalization about black people in ways that we would find, again, quite out of sync with statements that we could find in his earlier antebellum writing. So where is this all going? Well, Brown says that the slave would often get rid of punishment by his wit, and even when being flogged, the master's heart had been moved to pity by the humorous appeals of his victim. House servants in the cities and villages and even on plantations were considered privileged classes. Nevertheless, the field hands were not without their happy hours. Here Brown is, I think, trying to get to the place where he can say something about slave culture and to emphasize that the class situation among slaves, those who were so-called privileged classes, those who worked in agricultural labor 6 days a week, dawn to dusk, can see to can't see. He is trying to become more nuanced about what this experience for slaves was based on the classes that they belonged in or the classes of work that they did. And this is all certainly valuable when considering the difference between the notion of slavery during the antebellum period, when the anti-slavery movement simply presents slavery as a kind of hell on earth. Well, Brown is saying, well, some slaves had it worse than others. But in the process of doing so, he makes other statements about African Americans, their nature, their qualities, alimentativeness, amativeness, that come out of phrenology in the late 19th century. And Brown sort of comes across as a doctor analyzing the Negro and making statements about the Negro that are difficult to deal with, and certainly I'm not going to try to explain them away. Suffice it to say again that he would never have said anything like this in the antebellum period.
Bill, let me ask. William Wells Brown earned his crust through his writing. Might in 1880 he have been catering in his own writing to the prevailing literary marketplace here, or am I being too cynical in suggesting that?
Well, I think that Brown certainly was a professional writer, and a professional writer wants to be read, and he wants to be compensated for his work. So Brown understood in the antebellum period what would appeal to his readers, and he gave them what would appeal to his readers. Slave narratives were popular. He saw how many books Douglass had sold. He had a good story to tell, and he was a good writer. So he went out there and wrote for that market, and he did extremely well with it. It's hard to believe that Brown was somehow indifferent to the market after the war was over. And, of course, we're looking at just one little part of his book, My Southern Home. There are treatments of the Ku Klux Klan in the book. There are attacks on Jim Crow and racial discrimination in the book. It's a very complex book, and I don't want to give anyone the impression that this one little snippet that I pulled out of it is the whole story, because it's not. But certainly I think Brown realized how things were going, and that his white readers would be much more prepared to accept his portrayal of the African American after the war if he was more willing to subscribe to some of the assumptions about black people that were still highly popular among most white people in 1880.
Mm-hmm. We have just over half an hour to go. We've got a lot of territory to cover. Shall we move ahead then?
So I wanted to look at a portrait of a slaveholder in an antebellum narrative and a postbellum narrative. And the slaveholder is probably the most famous slaveholder in all of African American literature. It's Thomas Auld, Captain Auld, that Douglass writes about in his narrative. And of course, the way that Douglass presents Thomas Auld in 1845 is unreservedly negatively. He was cruel, he was cowardly, he was a sorry imitation of a slaveholder. He wasn't the real to-the-manor-born slaveholder. He was a poor man, master of a bay craft. That's why they called him captain. The only reason he became a slaveholder is that he married a woman who had slaves. He didn't know himself how to be a slaveholder. And the worst point of attack for Douglass is that he was a mean man. And he couldn't even conceal his meanness. So it's just everything that he says about Thomas Auld is dripping in contempt. He was a slaveholder without the ability to hold slaves. He was someone who was so lacking in respect among his own slaves that they wouldn't even call him master. They kept picking away at him, calling him Captain Auld, which was, of course, a subtle way of saying, we don't really regard you as deserving of being addressed as master. So that's the portrait of Thomas Auld in 1845. But Douglass went back to see Thomas Auld after the war was over, decades after he had achieved his freedom. In fact, he went to see Thomas Auld in 1879 when Auld was on his deathbed. And Frederick Douglass had become a United States Marshal and, of course, was an internationally famous man. So in his post-Civil War autobiographies, he wrote about this experience, about going back to see Thomas Auld, to visit the man who had once enslaved him. And so this visit is rarely studied because people rarely read Frederick Douglass's post-Civil War narratives. But if you do read it, you will see that Douglass went back to see Thomas Auld voluntarily, and he was at this time a man of considerable distinction. He certainly didn't have to go back to see Thomas Auld, had nothing to gain from it. But notice what Douglass says: "He was to me no longer a slaveholder, either in fact or in spirit, and I regarded him as I did myself, a victim of the circumstances of birth, education, law, and custom." If Booker T. Washington read that statement, he would have nodded vigorously in agreement. We want to present these white people as victims, as we were, of circumstances over which neither they nor we had control. Let us be magnanimous. Let us work for reconciliation, not for polarization. And so Douglass continues in the same strain. Our courses had not been determined for us, or had been determined for us, not by us. We had both been flung by powers that did not ask our consent into this relationship. And so Douglass goes on to say that after he made this trip, some people made fun of him. Some people said it was a weakening of my lifelong testimony against slavery. Some people thought that politically this was absolutely the wrong thing for Douglass to do. But he goes back to see Auld. It's not the only reason he went back to St. Michael's. He had several reasons for going back. He was going to be lionized in the area, and it was certainly pleasant to go back to his home country and to be identified back in St. Michael's on the Eastern Shore as a great man. But he wanted to go to see Auld, and when he went to see him, Auld called him Marshal Douglass. But Douglass called him Captain Auld, and after hearing himself called Marshal Douglass, he said, "Not Marshal, but Frederick to you." So they shake hands, and in the act of doing so, Mr. Auld begins to shed tears, and the sight of him, the changes which time had wrought in him, his tremulous hands constantly in motion, circumstances of his condition, for a time choked my voice and made me speechless. We both, however, got the better of our feelings and conversed freely about the past. What do they talk about? Auld says you certainly never should have been a slave, and if you ran away because you felt you were too smart to be a slave, I would have done the same thing. And Douglass makes a surprising statement, I did not run away from you, but from slavery. So there seems to be a great deal more positive feeling between these men. Douglass even apologizes to Auld for claiming that Auld had cruelly and ungratefully treated Douglass's grandmother, Betsy Bailey, after in the last years of her life. So he apologizes to Auld for having made this statement about Auld when it was not true. And Auld says that he never liked slavery anyway, and says, I meant to emancipate all of my slaves when they reached the age of 25. So the contrast between Auld in 1845 and Auld here in Douglass's last autobiography, 1892, is almost diametric. And many people, knowing the way Douglass had presented him in 1845, thought it's just unaccountable that he should present Auld in such a different light. But I don't think that it was unaccountable. I think it had very much to do with the mood of the postbellum slave narrative, which was to emphasize more the reconciliation of the sections, the South and the North, the blotting out of these great differences and an attempt to find common ground and to identify the former slave as the progressive person, as the person ready to enter the new century or the new era in a way that will lead and will establish the former slave as someone who's not going to be held back by old resentments, old injustice, and that sort of thing.
Bill, we have lots of questions backing up in the pipeline here, so let me get them out. Some of them have passed me by here, so I've got to scroll back a little bit. First, Pat Marshall would just like a little clarification on what drew Douglass to Mr. Auld's house. He speaks of an invitation. Was that from Auld? If so, why? If not, to what invitation is Douglass referring?
He was invited to speak
at
St. Michael's. There was going to be a celebration in his honor, and he liked to say, "I'm an Eastern Shore man." So he was gratified to be invited to come back and speak and to be celebrated for his accomplishments. And so while he was there, he went to see not only Thomas Auld, he also went to see Amanda Auld Sears, who was Auld's youngest daughter, because Frederick Douglass thought that Amanda Sears could give him some information about his birthday.
So he was invited by a group to speak on the Eastern Shore and then ended up visiting Auld.
Yeah, took advantage of the opportunity to go and see Auld as well.
Okay. And then we've had several questions that grew up around the question of stereotypes, particularly when you were talking about William Wells Brown, and Brown presented that image of the happy slaves. To what extent do you think that slave narratives contributed to the stereotypes, and to what extent do you think they fought against the stereotypes?
I think that the narratives before the war very strongly contributed to a much more humane and human view of people in slavery than white people mostly were prepared for. I think most white people, I don't care whether they were in the North or the South, either knew so little about black people that they couldn't have even presented a a stereotypical view. They knew so little and were so ignorant, they didn't even know the stereotypes. But those who did tended to have highly debased views of black people, and certainly didn't think about them as the heroic or the feeling and highly sensitive, highly ambitious people that the antebellum slave narrative portrays the people who wrote those narratives. The upward climbing, demanding, I want my freedom, I want opportunity, I'm not looking for someone to take care of me, I can take care of myself if you just give me my freedom. If you don't give it to me, I'm going to take it, I deserve it. That whole mentality that comes across so strongly in the antebellum narrative would have been news to the large majority of white Americans, South and North. After the war, I think that the slave narrative also combats stereotypes. I think particularly the image that the people who went through slavery and didn't become these, larger-than-life heroic resistors like Frederick Douglass or William Wells Brown, but the average person who went through slavery and didn't escape, but who simply held on and made it through to the end and emerged into freedom. The assumption about these people was, the stereotype was, that these people were demoralized, they were incompetent, they were incapable of taking care of themselves, they would be a burden on white society, and they were looking for someone to replace their masters, to take care of them until such time as their lives came to an end. So the image of the contented slave and the dependent free man is one that was the particular target of the postbellum narrators, who keep stressing, I went through slavery and I was tested and I was not found wanting. I survived. If I can go through slavery and make it, I can definitely make it in freedom if I just get any kind of a fair chance.
Right. And before we move ahead, one more question. To what extent did the mixed ancestry of many of these narrative authors influence their conciliatory attitude toward slavery?
I don't think that it had much influence at all, because it is true that some of the most famous of the antebellum narrators were people of mixed race, and I showed you examples of them. William Grimes was not famous in his own time. He's becoming more well known now, but certainly Brown and Douglass were the sort of men who white people were more likely to be interested in because they were mixed race. There was a certain fascination among the anti-slavery people for these kinds of men because of the stories that they could tell, which were in many cases based on interracial sex. Not that they told stories in any detail in this way, but it was a subject that certainly had its own kind of titillating appeal. But as far as being conciliatory, I don't think that Douglass and Brown were conciliatory during their heyday in the antebellum period. I think that it's a very complex fate to be mixed race, and in many cases, there's no advantage to a person like Douglass or a person like Grimes or someone like Moses Roper and being mixed races, so they have no reason to feel conciliatory. They know that some white people will feel less uncomfortable around an African American who is part white in heritage, but other white people will feel especially uncomfortable around an African American who is part white in heritage. And so there's no, you can't count on anything, especially. White racism flows in so many different directions towards many different people, regardless of their pigmentation or appearance.
Right. Okay, well, we've got about 20 minutes, so why don't we move ahead?
Many people, I'm sure, are familiar with Harriet Jacobs and her story, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, widely read nowadays. The reason why I put this in here is because I wanted to point out the difference between Jacobs and Elizabeth Keckley. Jacobs' narrative, an antebellum narrative, although barely. The book came out only a few months before the Civil War began. But she has a story to tell that's very similar to Elizabeth Keckley's story that came out 7 years later in 1868. And there are many ways in which these two women were similar, but one is that they both bore children by white men in relationships that both women found difficult to talk about, to write about, and were quite aware of the ways that they could be judged for having had these children out of wedlock by a white man during their enslavement. But how do they write about this, and how do they approach their reader? Jacobs talks about the way that she came to be a mother in ways that I think are designed to explain to the reader it's not a simple thing for you to read about this part of my life and then judge me. She is addressing, I think, a female reader, a white female reader, a happy woman whose purity has been sheltered from childhood, has not had to make the kinds of choices that the poor desolate slave girls had to make. And so Jacobs writes a great deal about how this happened, about what kinds of effects it had on her, about how she wrestled with the prospect of entering into a sexual liaison with a white man, about how she tried hard to preserve my self-respect, she says, but I was struggling alone in the powerful grasp of the demon slavery, and the monster proved too strong for me. So she ends up with these famous lines from the narrative, pity me and pardon me, O virtuous reader. You never knew what it is to be a slave. And so she says, you can't possibly know what I went through. At the same time that she asks for pity and she asks for pardon, as though her virtuous reader is going to look upon her with considerable moral judgment, she turns around and says, in looking back calmly on the events of my life, I feel that the slave woman ought not to be judged by the same standard as others. So there's a great deal of soul searching that goes on in Incidents in this part of the story. She tries to explain why she got into this relationship, and when she tries to explain to her virtuous reader why she wants pity and pardon, and then at the same time turns around and says, but you really can't judge me by the same standards that you might judge others who are in my same situation. In 1868, Elizabeth Keckley, a woman who had also been enslaved, a woman of mixed race just like Harriet Jacobs, a woman who had had similar kinds of circumstances of being a domestic worker in slavery, a woman who came from a family that had a great deal of impact on her life, the way that Harriet Jacobs came from a family that had a great deal of impact on her life. When Keckley writes about the way that she became pregnant, this is the whole thing. This brief paragraph. I was regarded as fair-looking for one of my race, and for 4 years a white man had base designs upon me. I do not care to dwell upon this subject. It is one that is fraught with pain. He persecuted me for 4 years, and I became a mother. The child of which he was the father was the only child I ever brought into the world. If my poor boy ever suffered any humiliating pangs on account of birth, he could not blame his mother. For God knows that she did not wish to give him life. He must blame the edicts of that society which deemed it no crime to undermine the virtue of girls in my then position. And that's all she has to say about it. She doesn't ask anybody's pity. She doesn't ask anybody's pardon. In fact, she explicitly says, don't try to blame this on me. I was in a society that did not care what happened to girls like me. And so I was not in a position to resist this persecution indefinitely. I became a mother, and that was me then, in my then position, she says. And I think her direct implication is, that's not who I am now. I'm not going to talk about who I was when I didn't have the power to control my circumstances. I'm going to talk about who I am now, and you're going to see the difference.
So it's that difference between looking back and looking at the present and the future. Is that a safe? Can we make a safe generalization there about the differences between pre and post Civil War narratives?
Yeah, and also Keckley's outlook is different from Jacobs's in the sense that there is much more of a kind of pragmatic ethic in the postbellum slave narrative that you don't find as much in the antebellum narrative. Jacobs seems to be very troubled by the idea that she's going to be judged, and even though she says, you can't judge me, at the same time, she seems strongly influenced by some very absolute values that say, you know, a woman should not get pregnant before her marriage, white women and black women should not be on the same level of respectability, and women who cross the color line to have sexual relationships with men on the other side of the color line are simply women of highly questionable virtue. Whereas after the Civil War, in Keckley's autobiography, she simply has a much more of a businesslike attitude towards these moral absolutes, and just says, because I wasn't in a position to make the decisions that I would have made if I had control of my body and my choices. Therefore, these are not topics that I'm going to go into. Instead, she presents an image of herself that is very much what I would call based on her desire to represent herself as a businesswoman.
Yeah. Yeah, we have an interesting comment from Scott here. I wonder if Jacob's circumstances were not particularly trying the years she spent in hiding and the desperate attempts to run away. Her life compares very sharply with Elizabeth Keckley's, as we'll see in the slides coming up. Keckley, I don't want to say she had a comfortable life, but she was, because of her great skill, she was more valued, and white people had a kinder view of her. They were willing to do things for her. In fact, they bought her freedom. So how would the differences of their circumstances shape the differences in their narratives? Yeah, particularly Scott writes, particularly as Jacobs did not have the marketable skills Keckley did.
Yeah, Jacobs was brought up as a girl who didn't even know she was a slave until she was 6 years old. Her mistress taught her to read, and she also taught her to sew. But the way that Jacobs represents herself in her autobiography She wants to be respected primarily for her absolute devotion to her children. She wants to be respected as a good mother. And she won't try to escape from slavery until she is sure that her children are out of the South. So when opportunities might have presented themselves to her, she wouldn't have taken them. And in fact, this is one reason why she hid out all those years, to look for a way to escape until she could be sure that her children were taken care of in this way. So Jacobs was a comparatively fortunate slave in the sense that she too was a town slave. She was not brought up on a plantation. She was not an outdoor agricultural worker. She was a domestic worker. She finally got away and made her living in the North as a domestic worker, basically as a nursemaid, and in that regard, she did something very different from what Keckley did. Keckley decided that she was going to turn her skills as a seamstress into her ticket out of slavery. Mm-hmm. Whereas Jacobs would not in any way countenance having her freedom purchased, and she certainly wouldn't have been willing to purchase her own freedom. Keckley seems to have been much more willing to follow a more conventional path, to say, well, if this is the way that I can get out of slavery, then I will pay what I have to pay in order to do that. So she's given the notice that she'll have to raise $1,200 to purchase her son and herself. And what we discover is that Keckley is able to do this because she has so many connections among white people.
Yeah.
So in this case, I wanted to point out that whereas when you read Keckley's story, you see that she goes around asking white people to advance her the money so that she can get free, and then she promises to pay it back. She never considers running away. It's just not a part of her story at all. And in this respect, she seems to be someone who's trying to tell her reader, I follow the laws of the land. I am someone who wants to be free in the right way, not in the wrong way. So she comes across as someone who is very conservative in certain ways. Whereas Jacobs says, I don't care what the laws of the land are. I'm not going to pay for myself. Mm-hmm. So she becomes a fugitive in the North and doesn't become free for over 10 years after she is able to get to the North. And how does she become free? Well, certainly not by purchasing herself. Certainly not by white people saying, "Oh, well, we'll step forward here and front you the money." Instead, she hears that people are coming from her hometown in the South, looking for her and trying to find her, trying to catch her and return her. And her employer, whom she calls Mrs. Bruce, in the in Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, of course, she gives everyone a different name from their actual name to protect everybody, including herself. That's when Mrs. Bruce finally decides, okay, enough is enough. I have the money. I'm just going to pay for you, and I'm going to buy you. The only problem is that Jacobs had told Mrs. Bruce that she didn't want her to do that. She had said explicitly that she did not want her freedom purchased, that she felt that was a compromise with slavery that was just insupportable. This is typical of the antebellum slave narrative. The narrators present themselves as very uncompromising. They have certain principles. They're not going to compromise them. Whereas, as I said, the postbellum narrators tend to be much more pragmatic, and that pragmatism is very clear in Elizabeth Keckley. Well, if this is the way I've got to do it in order to get free and stay free, then okay, I'll do it. And so the businesswoman becomes very businesslike as she aims for her freedom. And of course, after she gets her freedom, she gets to Washington, D.C. She starts a business as a dressmaker, and eventually becomes a dressmaker for the power elite in Washington, D.C.
Let me ask you about that.
On the other hand, Jacobs, on the other hand, is horrified when she sees the bill of sale for her purchase. At the same time, she says, I am deeply grateful to the generous friend who procured it, that is, her freedom, but I despise the miscreant who demanded payment for what never rightfully belonged to him or his. Does Elizabeth Keckley say anything like that about her master who required her to come up with $1,200? No. She just says, that's what I did, that's how I got the money, and on with the story.
In the forum, the person who posed the question about Keckley noted that Keckley said that her narrative reflected on the character of Mrs. Lincoln as much as it did on that of Elizabeth Keckley. Could that awareness of how the narrative would resonate with Mrs. Lincoln, could that help to account for Elizabeth Keckley's great emphasis on respectability and abiding by the law?
I think that whether Keckley had ever worked for Mary Todd Lincoln, she would have been the same person. I think that her life story is the story of a woman who was very self-conscious of being a member of the first generation of freed people. And one of the people who, like Frederick Douglass, whom she knew well, felt keenly that they were the vanguard of the race, that they were the people who'd be looked at for leadership among the freed people now that the war is over and slavery's been abolished. So they're very image-conscious people. And I think that Elizabeth Keckley was very especially image-conscious because she was not only an African-American and a former slave, but also a woman. And so she has all this highly self-conscious sense of, if she wants to establish herself as an actual leader of the race, and of course, who else has daily access to President and Mrs. Lincoln? Well, it's only Keckley. Then she's going to have to present herself in a way that I think she feels will be most conducive to positive images of the race, positive images of black womanhood, and that's what she tries to give you.
Right. So she might be seen as an early example of social uplift and the sort of thing we saw in the late 19th century with club women and people like that, really African-American club women trying to emphasize respectability, good manners, make an example, a high example of African Americans for the rest of the country to inculcate or cultivate that particular image.
Yes, and the role of her ability to work with white people, to get white people to join her, and in various efforts, not only to help her purchase her freedom, but she becomes a leader in what was called the Contraband Relief Society in Washington, D.C. during the war. All of these testify, just like Booker T. Washington wanted people to see, I am an African-American man, in her case a woman, who can work with white people, who can bridge the gaps, who can work towards reconciliation and progress.
Okay, let me just warn our participants that we've got a few more slides. We're going to go beyond our 8:30 time. Please bear with us. Bill, we have a really good question here that bears upon audience. As with all writing, we want to assess how the writer, whom for whom the writer is writing. Post-Civil War writers are writing for both the North and the South. Is that true? Were these narratives read widely in the South after the Civil War?
I think that they were read more widely in the South than the antebellum narratives were. And in fact, some post-Civil War narratives were published in the South, which of course there were no narratives by slaves published in the South before the Civil War, except for the poems of George Moses Horton. So the postbellum narrative is a much more of a national phenomenon. Simply where their narratives are published. Postbellum narrators are spreading all over the Midwest, the South, the Upper South, the New England, even into the far West, and they publish their narratives wherever they go. Whereas the antebellum narratives were almost all published in three big northern cities: New York, Boston, and Philadelphia.
Right.
So the postbellum narrative is much more of a national phenomenon.
Right. Okay, well, shall we move ahead then?
Well, some of the last passages that I have here I wanted to call your attention to because they illustrate class viewpoints. And they illustrate attitudes towards the North and the South that are interesting to compare, again, between antebellum and post-Civil War people. This is Austin Steward, was an antebellum narrator, a man of considerable influence in New York State, who had been enslaved in Virginia and then again in New York before he had gained his freedom in the state of New York. In this passage that I'm showing you here, he's talking about prejudice in the North, and he's laying it on the line. He is not soft-pedaling one bit the degree of racism and discrimination against black people in the North. Those of you who have read Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, know that when Douglass goes to the North, it's pretty much that his problems that he had are vastly improved. The North is portrayed as really the diametric opposite of the South. And Frederick Douglass, of course, moves up until by the end of the story we see that he's become a white-collar worker. This man who had been living in the North as a day laborer is suddenly catapulted into the national limelight as a lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society. And it looks like a beautiful portrayal of the idea that black people can move right up into positions of leadership and distinction. And this is the American dream, the day laborer who becomes a public intellectual, makes his living with his words, not with his body. But on the other hand, there are other antebellum narrators who are very, very explicit about just how racist the North is and just how much of a struggle it is for free-colored people, as he calls them in the North, to succeed against this crushing weight of prejudice. So what Steward also does in this passage is to characterize the fugitives, and he would be one of them, as a special class of black men who are to be admired for who they are and what they've accomplished. These fugitives may be thought to be a class of poor, thriftless, illiterate creatures like the Southern slaves, but it is not so. They are no longer slaves, many of whom have been for years free men. A large number were never slaves. They are a hardy, robust class of men, very many of them men of superior intellect, and men who feel deeply the wrongs they have endured. So here's Steward actually putting out a kind of class exemplar, putting out an image of the fugitive slave as a class exemplar, someone to be highly respected. In fact, to the point where he is distinguishing the fugitive slave in the North from the poor, thriftless, illiterate creatures, the slaves in the South. It's almost as though the fugitive slave is being elevated above these slaves who haven't run away, who aren't fugitives, to their detriment. So there's some implications there that can be a bit troubling. But at the same time, Steward is trying to elevate the fugitive into a superior kind of person who should be regarded as a genuine hero. Again, this is part of what I would call the identity project of the antebellum slave narrative, to elevate the rebel fugitive into a figure of great respect and admiration, almost larger than life, a hardy, robust class of men. Nothing like what people would have thought of, white people would have thought of, as a slave or a slave-like person. Now, I want to go back to a postbellum narrator, John Quincy Adams, when we look at his portrayal of the Southern gentry as he knew it when he was a slave in the Valley of Virginia during the 1860s. John Quincy Adams is a young man when he writes his autobiography in 1872. And he's from the working class. He is someone who wants to move up and who is trying to get an education for himself, trying to get training for himself. But he's not Frederick Douglass. He didn't escape from slavery. And he is trying to talk about the difference between phony style and real accomplishment, hard work, and success through one's own efforts. What style they, he says, of the white people in the South put off on the poor slave. But what is it now? I say, go and work for your money as I do. Then put on your style. I've seen some of the handsomest parties gathered together in the South that I ever saw in my life. They appeared in all their grandeur and splendor, with gold and diamonds of the best quality, if it did come off the poor slave's labor. And what added to the appearance of the magnificent sight was 9 or 10 colored men dressed in the very best, to wait on them. But since the Negroes are all free, that style is broken up. Look what their slaves done. They gave that class all their pleasure throughout the South, and they miss it very much at present, for they say so themselves, and I do not care if they do. They had it long enough for nothing. So there's a class of postbellum narrators like John Quincy Adams finding a voice after the war and speaking for their values. These are working people who are not like the great public intellectuals, Douglass and William Wells Brown, some of the other famous men who become so important, Henry Box Brown, Ellen and William Craft, people like that from the antebellum period become famous because of their writing. John Quincy Adams never became famous, but he wanted to make a statement in his autobiography about class. He wanted to represent his own class views, and he wanted to contrast them to the class of white people who he regards as so contemptible because they never worked for a day's living. They depended on their slaves to provide their living for them. So in this regard, if we think that My Southern Home by William Wells Brown is sort of catering to the popular view of the myth of the Old South, here is an African-American postbellum narrator who is definitely not catering, who is taking the mask off and of the grandeur and splendor and the myth of the Old South, and saying, well, they had it because they exploited the labor of people like me and my parents, and they had it long enough for nothing. Finally, I wanted to point to one more postbellum narrative. This is by Henry Clay Bruce, The New Man. Henry Clay Bruce was the brother of Blanche Kelso Bruce. Blanche Kelso Bruce was a United States Senator from Mississippi. These were two brothers. And Blanche K. Bruce never published his autobiography, but his brother Henry Clay Bruce did. And in the preface to Bruce's autobiography, he starts talking about classes of whites and of blacks within the slave system. It's all part of his effort to explain why some slaves ran away, others stayed, why some whites were cruel and domineering, and some whites were not. Why some people treated their slaves with fatherly care, as he said, saw that they were well fed and clothed, would not whip them, but others would do all of those things and more. So here we have someone who spent 22 years as a slave, who is not trying to say slavery was good, but who is trying to say that slavery was a highly complex institution composed of people in different situations, different levels of power, and that people within slavery could indeed take pride in themselves, even if they didn't run away, even if they didn't become famous fugitives. And so here he says, there were those slaves who would have suffered death rather than submit to dishonor, who, though they knew they suffered a great wrong in their enslavement, gave their best services to their masters, realizing philosophically that the wisest course was to make the best of their unfortunate situation. And so, ethos of the postbellum slave narrative coming out again. The wisest course was to make the best of their unfortunate situation. And as long as they weren't egregiously treated, Henry Clay Bruce says, these people would not run away. It's only if they were treated with this severe punishment that they would fight or run away. But there's Henry Clay Bruce's portrayal of the class of Negroes among the slaves who were lazy and mean, and then there are those who were, he says, had characteristics of good blood. By that he doesn't mean just that they were mixed race. He has a notion of good blood that seems more like the difference between aristocratic people and low-class people. And these people who had the good blood manifest themselves in the honor and ability and other virtues of their possessors. These virtues could be seen exemplified beneath black skins as beneath white ones. So whatever you might think of Bruce after you read his whole story and his whole philosophy of blood and his whole notion of the differences among whites as well as blacks, his effort is to try to present a more nuanced view of slavery, try to explain why some people behaved in ways that would still make them deserve to be treated honorably. People like himself, who were not fighters in slavery, but were people who realized and took pride and honor in the work that they did while they were enslaved.
So some of our postbellum narrators then are sort of trying to rescue the image of the slaves who didn't run away.
Yes.
All the slaves weren't heroes. Those of us who had to stay on the plantation were still honorable and respectable too.
Yes, and there's again, this is an attitude towards the majority of slaves. These are people voicing, like John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay Bruce, trying to voice the viewpoint of the majority, not the tiny minority,
Right.
who would become famous for running away.
Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of our seminar. And Bill, we do have one last question. Are there any post-Civil War narratives from former slaves who either stayed on the plantation or moved with their former masters to another area? These would have perhaps been those former slaves who were in a good situation and not mistreated. So do we have any narratives of people who stayed in the South?
Oh yes, yes. There are people who stayed in the South, but most of them moved on eventually. Of course, there are people who, like Washington, went back to the South. There are people like Washington who took a leaf out of Washington's book, so to speak, and who said, I'm going north to get an education, and then I'm coming back into the South to live and to work, to found institutions like Washington's, where there are clergymen who go to the north to get training and who come back to the South. There are other people who never leave the South because they feel that they have a strong mission in the South. And like that, and to
stayed in the South and the WPA slave narratives that were gathered in the 1930s. Yeah,
yes.
you have to be careful using them, but of course they can be really useful teaching tools. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for staying with us. We went well over our time. Bill, I want to thank you very much for an interesting seminar. I learned a great deal. I'm sure our participants did as well. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm glad to do it.
And I want to thank our participants for their enthusiastic and intelligent conversation and participation this evening. I want to remind you to please continue to use the seminar form, share fresh approaches and discussion questions. We'll monitor the form to February 13th. That means that we will pass questions and comments on to Bill as they come in. Please check AmericaInClass.org webinars for our upcoming seminars. Our next one is Thursday, February 5th at 7 p.m. World War II in Public Memory, the Good War Thesis Revisited. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and good evening.